Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for who you are. We praise you for what you've done. We praise you for what you're doing and what you will do, God. I thank you for every man and woman in this room and for anybody who might be watching online, God. I thank you for the opportunity that you've afforded us to be able to talk freely about you and to commune with fellow believers, God, and to grow in our understanding of you and ideally to grow in godliness, God. We love you, God. We praise you just for the opportunity and the privilege to serve you because you really are deserving of our service. In any place where we have strayed, please humble us and bring us to repentance. And in any places where we might be overlooking ways where we can be doing better, please convict us and help us yearn for your glory. And help us actually live according to that. So in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okie doke. So, today we have a difficult task ahead of us. I don't know if we can pull it off. We're going to try. Because thus far we have been walking through the story of the Bible. We spent, I believe, 4 weeks in Genesis. We spent 2 weeks in Exodus. And then now, today, my goal is to cover Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All in 1 week.
All right.
And that is not because I don't want you to mistakenly think that is because these books are less important. That is something that might mistakenly be conveyed by going through it quicker. But the reason why we're going through these quicker is because I'm mainly trying to emphasize the storyline of the Bible. And while Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are extremely prominent, there's not as much storyline to them, right? They're prominent for different reasons, right? Because whenever you look at Leviticus and Numbers in particular, you feel it's very law-heavy. And Deuteronomy is almost like a big sermon/law thing, right? And so there's not as much storyline to it. And so what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the books individually, and we're going to talk about why they're significant. But the main thing that I'm going to be focusing on is how it contributes to the overall story of Scripture as a whole, right? And so that's why we can go through these quicker. And I just want to clarify right off the bat, no, that does not mean these books are less significant. You should study Leviticus, you should study Numbers, you should study Deuteronomy. I know at least one person in this room who Deuteronomy is their favorite book in the Bible, right? And she's sitting right over there, right? And so Deuteronomy is fantastic, and so are Leviticus and Numbers. But just for the sake of time, we're going to go through them a little bit quicker because you can just do that, right? It's a little bit easier. And Numbers actually probably has the most stories of all of them, but Numbers is probably also the book we're going to go through the quickest because it's easy to summarize the main point of the book of Numbers, if that makes sense. And so let's start with Leviticus, which I have titled The Holiness Code. If you remember, maybe just somebody real quick, can y'all summarize for me the main storyline of the book of Exodus? And I do not need in-depth stuff, right? I do not need a play-by-play. I don't need anything like that. Just somebody give me an overview. Where does Exodus start and where does it end? Like, what is the overall storyline?
The chosen people of God, who are the Israelites, are in captivity in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And God elects this person named Moses to be the one through whom he works in order to free them from bondage from Egypt. And the whole goal through all this is that they can go into the wilderness and serve God. And it's also supposed to be a testament of God's power and that he's able to single-handedly provide for the people of Israel without anybody else helping. So it's not only a testament to his own people that he can serve, but it's also a testament to the surrounding nations who worship other gods. Hey, I'm Yahweh, and I'm the greatest, the one and only true God.
Yeah, perfect. So the Exodus story that we read about, specifically Exodus chapters 1 through 15, that's basically the quintessential Jewish story in all Scripture, right? For the rest of the Bible, including the New Testament, you're constantly going to be looking back at the Exodus as the moment where God made himself known. Yes, he interacted with people in the book of Genesis, but it was in the book of Exodus where God really flexed. And it was in Exodus where God really just showed off who he was in order to woo the people of Israel and in order to drive the fear of him into the nations, right? And then eventually what happens is Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. And one thing that you need to understand is that whenever we're talking about the Torah, right, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Mount Sinai is super duper important. So that whenever you actually look at the book, like all 5 books as a whole, there is a certain structure that is emphasizing the Sinai narrative, right? And what I mean by that is this. we've talked in the past about how there's this let me just talk a little bit about narrative structures, right? So nowadays, whenever we tell stories in the present time, usually what we'll do is whenever we're telling a story, any story will have an inciting moment which escalates in conflict until you reach a climax, and then it's followed by a quick resolution, right? That's usually how we tell stories nowadays, right? Usually it's separated into like 3 acts. That's usually how we do it. In the ancient cultures, though, they had different ways of telling stories. They could do it that way, but sometimes what they would do is they would actually tell the story where there's like the beginning and ending were parallel, and they were working towards a climax which is in the middle, right? And we've talked about this in the past, where you see like the A, B, C, D, C, B, A structure. Does anybody remember what that's called?
Chiasm.
A chiasm, right? A chiasm, yes. So chiastic structure is very common in Scripture, just like it is in ancient cultures in general, especially in the ancient Near East, which is where the Bible's being written at. And you see a chiastic structure to an extent in just how the Torah itself is structured, right? Exodus chapters 12 through 18, these are the stories of the people of Israel in their desert wanderings after they get out of Egypt, right? So Exodus chapter 12 is the final plague, and the people are set free, right? And then chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, those are their journeys from Egypt to Sinai, right? Whenever you get to Numbers chapter 10, the people finally pick up and leave Sinai, and they begin to move in chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, all the way to 32. They begin to slowly move surely to the edge of the Promised Land, right? Where they finally get to the plains of Moab, and they are looking across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. So Exodus chapters 12 through 18 and chapters 10 through 32 of Numbers, those are the desert wandering periods of the story, right? So we've got from Egypt to Sinai, and then we've got from Sinai to the Promised Land, and everything in between, from Exodus chapter 19 through Numbers chapter 9, all of that is at Mount Sinai. I want you to notice the parallels here, right? So both before Sinai and after Sinai, you have 6 representative campsites, right? So whenever you actually read the book of Numbers, it tells you all the places that Israel camped at, but we don't read stories from every single campsite, right? Instead, there are 6 different stories we read in the Exodus account, 6 different stories in the Numbers account, right? In both, before and after, you read 7 mentions of the desert, right? In the first story, you have God's provision of manna and quail. In Numbers, you have God's provision of manna and quail. In the Exodus story, you have Israel requesting water, resulting in water gushing from a rock. And in the Numbers story, you have Israel requesting water, resulting in water gushing from a rock, right? In the Numbers story, it actually ends differently because Moses ends up disobeying God, and he gets punished for it, right? In both stories, you have an angel of Yahweh protecting Israel, right? On one, whenever they are leaving Egypt, the angel of Yahweh is protecting them from the Egyptians, right? Remember, that's whenever they go through the Red Sea. Well, when you get to the book of Numbers, as they are approaching the plains of Moab, you have the angel of Yahweh protecting them from the Moabites. And this is whenever you actually read the story of Balaam, the son of Beor, who is like making all these prophecies and stuff like that, right? And so you have these parallels. On both ends, you have Israel fighting Amalek. On both ends, you have Moses meeting with a Midianite family member. And then in both, you also have Moses being weighed down by leadership. And then you have Moses delegating responsibilities. And you also get to see how Israel is responding to people, right? Back before Mount Sinai, Israel is responding to Egyptian armies, and they're saying, we miss Egypt, right? Remember whenever they were on the edge of the Red Sea, and the army is racing towards them, and they say, why didn't we just stay in Egypt, right? They're saying we want to go back. Well, in the same way, whenever you get to the book of Numbers, the thing that kicks off the whole wilderness wanderings is that the people of Israel are going to hear what the spies say about the promised land of Canaan, and they say, we should have stayed in Egypt, right? And so, both before Sinai and after Sinai, you have all these different parallels that basically serve the purpose of sandwiching the Sinai narrative in the middle, right? And if you know anything about a sandwich, what's the best part of the sandwich?
Meat.
The meat, the stuff in between the bread, right? And so, whenever we get to Mount Sinai, usually as readers, this is the stuff that we find the most boring, right? Because all of a sudden laws start being given and stuff like that. But you have to realize that from an Israelite perspective, Mount Sinai is the peak, right? And so you've got Genesis and Deuteronomy, which kind of serve to cap the Torah by, basically Genesis is telling you the introduction to who God is and who Israel is. And then Deuteronomy is telling you who God will make Israel to be and how God is going to use Israel to accomplish his purposes. But then Exodus and Numbers begin and end with desert travels, which ultimately culminate at them arriving at Mount Sinai, where you really get to see the peak of the Torah, right? It's out Mount Sinai where Israel becomes Israel, right? Like Brianne pointed out, the whole point of the Exodus was not simply to get them to the Promised Land. The point was to get them out of captivity so that they could learn to serve God in the wilderness. Where is it that they do that? At Mount Sinai, right? So for us, kind of like the Israelites, we see them get to Mount Sinai and we're like, oh, right, let's just move on and get to the Promised Land, right? That's what the Israelites wanted too. But that's not what God wanted. God wanted them to get to Mount Sinai so that he could teach them to be who they were meant to be. And in the end, they're only going to be camped at Mount Sinai for a little bit less than a year, right? They're actually not at Mount Sinai for that long. But most of the Torah is set during that year, right? Because that is the year where Israel learned to become Israel. And we talked a little bit about this stuff at the end of last week, right? Remember, we saw them get to Mount Sinai. We got to see that they had this whole kind of marriage ceremony with God. We got to see God give the 10 Commandments. We got to see Moses go up the mountain. And then we eventually got to see the people turn away from God and start worshiping a golden calf. And Moses had to fix all of that stuff, which ultimately resulted in Israel's repentance and Moses' restoration of the people. They renewed the covenant. And then how did Exodus end?
Wasn't it the construction of the tabernacle?
Yes. We saw the construction of the tabernacle immediately followed by God coming to arrive. Can somebody go get the door for me? So we saw them constructing the tabernacle, immediately followed by God's presence coming to dwell in their tabernacle. This all serves the purpose of setting up Leviticus, because when we get to the book of Leviticus, hey Maverick, when we get to the book of Leviticus, all of a sudden we have a problem, right? Because if you go way back to the book of Genesis, we realize that there's an issue between God and man now, right? There's this thing called sin that has entered the picture, and it makes it very difficult for God and man to live together. It just makes it very difficult, right? Because God is righteous, man is wicked, and so, God can dwell with man, but, he's going to be wanting to destroy them pretty constantly because he's so righteous, right? That makes it problematic. And now, at the end of Exodus, we kind of have a miniature version of the Garden of Eden sitting in the midst of the camp of Israel, right? So we've got a holy God dwelling in the midst of an unholy people. And so the way Exodus ends is we have a problem that needs to be solved. Either God has to become unholy, which we know is not possible, or what do the Israelites have to do?
Become holy.
They have to become holy, right? Well, that's what the purpose of Leviticus is, which makes sense if you're viewing this whole Torah thing as it's like a mountain. Leviticus is the peak, right? Leviticus is the place where the people of Israel are going to learn to be holy as God is holy. And so whenever you read the story, you can actually see that, I actually ended with this last week. But you can see how Leviticus answers this problem, right? So the way the Exodus ends is that we read, Exodus chapter 40, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had dwelt on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle, right? So at the end of Exodus, we have a problem, right? Moses, who has interacted with God pretty well thus far, he can no longer enter the tabernacle because God is so holy and his presence is so intense, right? It's kind of like looking at the sun, right? We can look at it when it's at sunset or sunrise, but we can't look at it when it's at high noon. And if we were to simply get into a spaceship and start traveling towards the sun, very quickly we would realize that the closer we get, the harder it is to survive, right? Well, now God is not dwelling far away in the highest heaven, and he's not even dwelling far away on the top of a mountain. He is dwelling in their midst. And so Moses, he can't even enter into the tabernacle. We've got an issue. And sure enough, when you get to the first verses of Leviticus, you read, then Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man from among you brings an offering near to Yahweh, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock. So we see Moses is outside the tent of meeting, and God is inside the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and he's having to call to Moses from inside. Right? So you have this distinction and this separation. Well, the book of Leviticus is going to teach the people how to be holy as God is holy. So by the time you get to the first verse of the book of Numbers, notice what you read. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the numbers of Israel. Right? So, do you see the difference there? Now, Moses is with God in the tabernacle again. Right? So, it seems like the book of Leviticus has served its purpose. Right? At the beginning of Leviticus, Moses cannot enter the tent. By the beginning of Numbers, Moses can. What happened in between? The book of Leviticus. And so, whenever you read through it, what God's going to do is he is going to begin to outline to the people what it looks like to be holy. Right? What does it mean to actually walk in communion with God? And there's really two primary ways that it's going to be broken down. We're going to be talking about ritual purity and moral purity. Right? Ritual purity is the one that we don't really understand as well from like a modern perspective because it just seems so foreign to us, especially as American Christians. So we'll spend a little bit longer talking about that in a second. But moral purity, we understand pretty well, right? Because moral purity is simply the distinction between right and wrong, right? I mean, everybody in here knows that there is a moral code to existence, right? It is wrong to murder somebody. It is right to save somebody's life, right? It is wrong to assault somebody. It is right to defend somebody, right? We know that that's true, right? We know it is wrong to steal. We know that it is right to give gifts, right? Those are things that we understand as humans because we understand, like our conscience itself testifies to the fact that there is right and wrong. And so many things in Leviticus, especially when you look at Leviticus chapters 18 through 20, are dealing with right and wrong scenarios, right? These are basically things that are wrong, things that are morally impure. They are caused by violations of God's moral code, right? God cannot tolerate immoral behavior, and so if he is to dwell with Israel, then the Israelites need to live rightly and with integrity. His people are to be holy as he is holy, right? So that is a big component to living before God, and many of the laws that you read even outside of Leviticus deal with this, right? This is why God says, do not commit adultery. This is why God says, do not murder. This is why he says, do not steal. It's because God has a moral code that he expects his people to uphold. Right? And if they don't uphold that, they are doing what is evil, and since God is good, he will punish them for that. Right? So a big part of Leviticus is just teaching them, here's what you're not supposed to do, because if you do it, you are doing an evil thing. But there's also this whole other component to Leviticus, which is very strange to us, because oftentimes the language that is used here is something that we often attach a moral status to, but it's not really intended by Leviticus. Because what you'll read in Leviticus, specifically chapters 11 through 15, but also throughout the rest of the book, and really throughout the Bible, is you will hear about clean and unclean, right? And whenever somebody is made unclean, this is caused by substances associated with death, such as corpses, bodily fluids, mold, skin disease, such as that, as well as foods that go beyond the prescribed diet, right? There are going to be things that God calls unclean, right? Unclean foods such as, like pigs, right? He calls them unclean. Cleanliness was necessary to participate in ritual activities, but we don't want to mistakenly think that uncleanliness is the same as sinfulness, right? This is something that we often mistake because we will read things and it'll say, whenever a woman gives birth, she is made ritually unclean. And we read that and we think, is it saying that it was a sin for her to give birth? That's not what it's saying at all. Whenever it says that it is ritually unclean, it means it's unclean. And if you've ever seen a woman give birth, you will understand what it means by that, right? It's a beautiful process, but it is a gross process in the sense of that there are a lot of different bodily fluids involved, and it's a messy thing. And so one thing that God specifies in regards to his people is that when they worship him, not only do they have to be morally clean, right? But ritually speaking, they also need to be in a state of cleanliness, right? So it's not sinful to be unclean, right? What is sinful is to go before God in a state of uncleanness, if that makes sense, right? And so there will be things where it says, like, whenever a woman is on her, like, menstrual cycle, right? That would be a time of uncleanness. Well, God is the one who gave that, right? So God is the one who designed that. It's not saying that that in and of itself is sinful. But there are certain steps that need to be taken before you go before God when in that state, right? And if you go before God while in that unclean state, that is what becomes sinful, right? Because what you're doing is you're not honoring God's set apartness in the sense of like just being just clean, right? It's more representative, if that makes sense. Were you going to say something?
Yes. I think I may understand why, clean and unclean was so important back then. Because throughout my life, I've noticed that I seem to be the only one who kind of had subconsciously known this about this clean versus unclean thing, but I didn't realize it until now. But anyway, the reason is probably because the unclean things may represent shame, kind of like nakedness does.
Maybe. I don't know if it's just associated with that, though, because, some of the unclean stuff is food, right? So it's not, like, some of the stuff is, to be fair.
There's a different formula for each of these, but it's ultimately the same thing in terms of what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, the ultimate thing I'm just trying to get across is that whenever you read clean and unclean in the Bible, I don't want you to inherently think sinful. Right? It's not that, like, all pigs are evil, right? It's just that, like, basically cleanliness is something that inherently cleanliness will go away with, uncleanliness goes away with time, right? You bathe yourself, you offer the sacrifice, you are declared ritually clean, you can now go before God, right? That's usually how it goes, right? And so I think it's just important for us to make that distinction because nowadays, like, this distinction is important for us because a lot of the times whenever we use the terms clean and unclean in Christian circles, we attach a moral component to it, right? Whenever I say I feel unclean, I am associating that with, like, being guilty, right? That's not exactly what this means, right? Unclean literally just means that you are physically unclean, and the only thing that makes you guilty is if you go before God while unclean, right? So there are certain, so a lot of the specifications you'll read in chapters 11 through 15, it will tell you, here is what the priest needs to do to help an unclean person become clean so that they can then conduct themselves properly amongst the people of Israel, right? And so there were just certain things that they had to do in order to become clean again, and then everything got back to normal, right? Whereas whenever you're talking about moral purity and stuff, well, that's dealing with stuff that, no, you've done this is horrible, right? It'll talk about, like, okay, you slept with your aunt. That is bad, right? That is not simply being ritually unclean. That is morally reprehensible. That is horrible, right? You had sexual relations with a goat, right? That is horrible, right? It'll talk about that, though, right? It'll say you cannot do that, right? There's a distinction there. It is not simply clean and unclean. It is holy and profane, right? Like there's a distinction, right? And so when you're reading through Leviticus, you're going to see those different categories. And what God demands of his people is that they uphold both, right? If they are going to go before him, not only must they be morally pure, but they must be ritually pure as well. Because the only thing, moral purity isn't the only thing that sets God apart from man, right? He is set apart in all ways, right? And so they are supposed to set themselves apart in many ways in order to go before him, right? And so when you read through Leviticus, you're going to see both components, and both were equally essential when it comes to how Israel presented themselves before God. This is how the book of Leviticus is structured. Surprise, surprise, it's a chiasm, right? Chapters 1 through 7, we read about how Israel is able to draw near to God, right? And so when you read chapters 1 through 7, you're going to read all the different rules and requirements when it comes to sacrifices, right? Sacrifices are a weird thing to us because we don't really deal with those, right? It'd be a very different culture if every time we went to church, we had to bring, like, a goat in there and sacrifice it on an altar. We don't do that because we believe that Jesus fulfilled the purpose of all those sacrifices. But for them, this was very important, right? And so, like, even to this day, I've got a Tanakh sitting in there. A Tanakh is the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, right? I've got a Tanakh sitting in there, and if you go to the back of it, it has charts breaking down the details of all these sacrifices. Because if they ever rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, you know what they'd have to get back to? Sacrifices. From a Jewish perspective, that's what they would have to do. And so, chapters 1 through 7 for us are very boring. For them, it's essential. Because if they do not give the proper sacrifice in the proper way, then there's no way that they can commune with God, right? God is only going to meet with them if they are responding to him as he ought be responded to. And then, immediately following that, in chapters 8 through 10, we have the priesthood being established, right? This is going to be Aaron and his sons in the tribe of Levi. They are going to be the priests. Aaron and his sons are the high priests. And we just get to hear about exactly what this priesthood looks like. And we also get to see that apparently the priests, their primary goal And their primary responsibility is to basically enforce the rules, right? They are the ones who realize that if man and God are to commune together, God is the one who decides how that's going to happen, right? Man does not get to decide, right? It's not like, ooh, well, like nowadays we make a big deal about this. Ooh, well, I just relate to God in my own personal way. Priests recognize that that's not how this works, right? If God and man are to relate, God is the one who decides how that's going to happen, right? Because God is the one who is above us. And so if God specified that the sacrifice has to meet this requirement and this requirement, well, then the priest is going to assert it better meet this requirement, this requirement. And if it does not meet that, it does not count, right? And this makes sense. Sometimes we might look at that and we're like, wow, they're kind of like jerks. Well, you're not going to think that whenever you have a kid and you realize that you put certain rules in, like, whenever you tell your kid to not cross the road, your kid thinks that you're being mean and oppressive. You're watching out for their safety, right? Well, that's what the priests are doing, right? The priests are following these rules because they're watching out for the people's safety. If the people do not follow these rules, well, then their relationship with God is going to be tainted because they are choosing to rebel against God, right? And so we see the priesthood established, and we get to see that the priests, above everybody else, are going to have to be holy. The issue is that the people don't, like the priests don't really do it that well. And then, moving onwards, chapters 11 through 15, we get the ritual purity that I was talking about, right? We read about clean and unclean things, clean and unclean foods, clean and unclean this, clean and unclean that, right? You read about skin diseases and all stuff like that. You read that there. Let's skip chapter 16 for right now. We'll come back to that in a second because that is the climax of the whole book. But then let's look about the parallels going away, right? So if chapters 11 through 15 were about the ritual purity, about clean and unclean stuff, well, chapter 17 through 22, that deals with moral purity, right? It talks about holiness for God's people, and it contrasts, rather than clean and unclean, it contrasts holy and profane, or holy and common, right? And what you're going to read throughout this section is God demanding that his people be holy as he is holy, right? What does the word holy mean?
Set apart.
Set apart, right? And so they must be holy rather than common, right? They must be set apart rather than like the world, right? They must be godly, not worldly, right? That's what is being emphasized throughout this whole thing. And then you get to chapters 23 through 25, and look at that, we're talking to the priests again, right? So if the priesthood is established, chapters 8 through 10, chapters 23 through 25, we get the priests receiving more instructions on how they are supposed to actually conduct worship. And then, if chapters 1 through 7 are about how Israel is to draw near to God, chapters 26 to 27 emphasize, now that Israel is near to God, how is Israel supposed to live alongside God? And we have this reinforcement of several different punishments and vows that the people of Israel are being charged to keep as they go about this. And so you can see that there's that chiastic structure where the beginning parallels with the end, working its way in, and the climax comes on the Day of Atonement. Right? In Hebrew, anybody know what this is called?
I've heard the word atonement before. I think they defined it in the church I go to.
Yeah. I just wanted to see if anybody knew the Hebrew name for the holiday. Yom Kippur.
Oh.
Right? Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. This is the one day of the year whenever the priest could go in to the Holy of Holies to offer a sacrifice before God. And this is also a day whenever they would sacrifice a goat, they would send another goat into the wilderness to die, called the scapegoat. And this whole celebration is the central point of the book of Leviticus because it is the most significant day of the year. Because on Yom Kippur, the people are atoned for, right? You can understand what atonement is by breaking down the word, right? At one mint, right? It's the moment in like time where man and God are unified once again, right? At one, right? Where we know that there's this division between us, right? God is way over here, we are way over here. Well, I guess it's probably more like this. God is way up there and we are way down here, right? There's this vast chasm between us, and that chasm is caused not only by our natures, but because of sin. Well, on the Day of Atonement, the priest goes in and offers a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people, to signify the fact that we need a sacrifice to help us out, right? To mend the problem, right? And so what they do is, they put the hand on the goat before they sacrifice it. They put the hand on the other goat before they send it out in the wilderness. And it represents a transfer of power, right? My sin is placed on the goat, and this innocent goat dies in my place, right? And because God looks down on the Ark of the Covenant and he sees the blood seeping over the mercy seat, which is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, whenever he sees the broken law inside the covenant, he can't see it anymore, right? Because now the blood of the innocent animal has washed it over, right? So instead he sees the blood of an innocent animal shed, which then covers the broken covenant so that God can forgive man. Right? And in many ways, the Day of Atonement kind of calls back to the Passover event, right? And really, they kind of communicate in many ways the same message. But this one day in particular is set apart specifically to remind the people of their need for a sacrifice to point them to God. And so that's the focal point of Leviticus, right? Because if Leviticus is if Leviticus is the peak of the Torah, well, the Day of Atonement is the peak of Leviticus, right? It is the peak of peaks because it points out the main issue that the Torah is trying to highlight, right? What did we read about in Genesis chapter 1? God created the heavens and the earth. What did we read about in Genesis chapter 3? Man screwed it up, right? And so the whole Torah, kind of like the whole Bible, is pointing out the fact that man and God cannot live together because of sin. And so God is providing means by which to fix the problem. And the height of the Torah is chapter 16 Leviticus, where you get to see the priest entering the Holy of Holies, right? I mean, here we are in the chapter of chapters, in the law of laws. And the priest enters the Holy of Holies to offer the sacrifice of sacrifices to please the God of gods, right? That is what's being pointed out here. And we realize that the Torah is screaming that if man and God are to dwell together, a sacrifice needs to be made. As Christians, we can, this is why we would understand, this is how we would understand the cross, right? And that's why it always frustrates me whenever people try to tell people to, just read the Gospels and, skip the Old Testament. If you skip the Old Testament, you're not going to understand the Gospels because you're going to be super confused why Jesus had to die, right? Because, you know the story, but you're going to be like, why was this necessary, right? Jesus just looks like some random guy who just got killed. But if you read the Old Testament and you get through the Torah and you realize that the peak of the Torah is talking about how man and God cannot dwell together unless a fitting sacrifice is offered, you're like, oh. And if you realize that the Day of Atonement is the one day that the high priest can enter the Holy of Holies, and then whenever you realize that Jesus dies in the temple, in the veil, separating the Holy of Holies from everybody else, ripped at that moment, you realize, oh, I see what's happening here. Right? So in Jesus' death, he gives us access to God. Right? You're not going to understand any of that unless you understand the Old Testament. And unfortunately, people will usually tell you, okay, read the Old Testament, but skip Leviticus. What? No, this is where it's at, right? So you need to understand this stuff, right? And if you understand this, you're like, whenever Jesus shows up, you're like, I see exactly what Jesus is doing. It all makes sense. And so there's Leviticus, but that's all we're going to cover in regards to Leviticus. Mainly because, once again, we're trying to cover a little bit more stuff today. So let's go into the book of Numbers. Does anybody know why the book of Numbers is called the book of Numbers?
There's a lot of numbers in it.
The numbering of the people.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that, yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but yeah, it's because there's a lot of numbers in it. The way the book begins and ends is with the people of Israel taking a census. And you might wonder why it begins and ends with a census, because you're like, well, they took a census at the beginning of the book, why would they need to take another one? Well, that's because over the course of the book of Numbers, everybody in the first census dies. Mm-hmm. And by the time you get to the end of the book, we got a whole new generation because the people have been punished for their sin. Mm-hmm. And so we call the book Numbers because of that. But I actually like the Hebrew name for the book of Numbers even better. In Hebrew, it's called Bamidbar, which literally means in the wilderness. That actually gives you a better summary of the book itself, because the book of Numbers details the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. The way the book of Numbers is structured is as follows, right? So we start off chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 10, and we pick up right where Exodus and Leviticus left off. We are still camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, right? You get to chapters 10, verse 11 through chapter 12, verse 16, and the people begin to travel. And we get to read about them stopping at different camps and whatnot. Until chapters 13 through 19, we read about them in the wilderness of Paran. And then After spending quite some time in the wilderness of Paran, chapters 20 through 21, they travel again until chapters 22 through 36, they arrive at the plains of Moab. You'll see that I've given all these little subtitles, which I think kind of convey the whole point of their sections, right? So the foot of Mount Sinai is moving from the mountain, right? Because here at the foot of Mount Sinai, Israel has learned to become Israel, right? They showed up at Mount Sinai as a band of slaves who was recently freed from captivity. But by the time they leave Mount Sinai, they are an army that has a government, that has a law, and they have a purpose, and they are actually a full-fledged nation, right? So only a year has passed, but they are not the same people as they were before, right? They have made a covenant, they have broken the covenant, they have renewed the covenant, they have actually grown up as people, right? And so whenever you get to these opening chapters of Numbers, you get to see that these people have become a nation, hence why there needs to be a census, right? Let's count these people. Let's see how God has been faithful to fulfill his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so that's what we see at the beginning of Numbers. But then, as the book progresses, we begin to realize, okay, it's time to move from Mount Sinai, right? We weren't meant to stay here forever, right? It's time to pack up things, and let's begin to make our way to the Promised Land. We get to chapters 13 through 19, and I called that Wandering Through the Wasteland, because we realized that while the people did mature a little bit during that year at Sinai, they weren't made perfect, and they're going to make a really big mistake. And this mistake is going to result in the entire generation that left Egypt dying in the wilderness. And it's only their children who are going to get to actually enter the Promised Land, which is really sad. And so you leave Mount Sinai and you're filled with hope. You're like, let's do this. We're going to go conquer the Promised Land. It's going to be awesome. And then very quickly you realize, all right, the people have grown, but not as much as they might think, right? And we realize that this is not going to be an easy journey. And just like God said, remember back in Exodus chapters 32 to 34, how God said, if I go with you, I will end up destroying you? Well, you see why. Because God realized these people might learn from their mistakes, but they're still going to make the same mistake again, right? They're less, like, what they learn is going to be very short-lived. And people are very quick to return to their sin. And so chapters 13 through 19, they are traveling, and they're going to be traveling there for a while. Eventually, though, in the end of the book of Numbers, chapters 22 to 36, they do finally arrive in the plains of Moab. And if you remember where Moab's at, it is directly to the east of the Jordan River. And it is basically looking into the land of Canaan. Right? And so they finally arrive at the edge of the Promised Land, which they actually did arrive there during chapters 13 through 19. They didn't arrive at Moab, they arrived nearby. But because of their sin, they had to leave and wander for 40 years. But then they do arrive at Moab, where you read a few more different stories, which will then set up the book of Deuteronomy. Sound good? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's walk through some of this. Just timeline stuff here. You go back, whenever you actually read the book of Numbers, in chapter 33, it begins to recap all the different travels that Israel went through, and it actually gives us a set date for when Israel left Egypt, right? It tells us they journeyed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the next day after the Passover, the sons of Israel started out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians, right? So the day that the Israelites left Egypt was on Nisan 15, right? Nisan is not that's the name for the Hebrew month. They would have used a different name back then. I'm using the name that Israelites would use, like the Jewish people would use nowadays. Right back then, I believe it was called Aviv or something like that. But Nisan 15 roughly correlates to April for us, because this is the day after Passover, right? So Passover begins on the 14th of Nisan, and that's usually in late March or early April. And so Nisan 15, that is when they left Egypt, right? They left around April. And then we read in Exodus chapter 19, in the third month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on this day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Then they set out from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Right? So, a little less than 3 months later, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai. Right? It says on this day. People will translate that a little bit differently. Some people think that it's supposed to say on the first day. So it's the first day of the third month, which would be about 2.5 months later, right? So if you're 15 days in the first month, and you go through the second month, third month, you're dealing with roughly maybe like 45-ish days since they left Egypt. And according to tradition, God's presence came to dwell on Mount Sinai exactly 50 days after Passover. And that's why people would associate this Feast of Pentecost with God coming to dwell on Mount Sinai. And so we're still in year 1, right? We're probably in the month of June at this point, right? So they left Egypt in April. They arrive at Mount Sinai in June. And then, Exodus chapter 40, now it happened in the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. Moses erected the tabernacle and laid its bases, right? So now we are roughly a year after they left Egypt, which is probably about 10-ish months since they arrived at Mount Sinai. Moses erects the tabernacle, right? And God's presence comes to dwell in the tabernacle around that time period, right? And so they've only been out of, like, this is actually kind of cool, right? They have only been out of Egypt for a little bit less than a year by the time the tabernacle has been built, right? And then, now it happened in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, that the cloud was lifted over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So this is in May of the second year, right? So this is basically 11 months after they came to camp at Mount Sinai, they leave. And this is only 2 months after the presence of God came to actually dwell inside the tabernacle. Which tells us that apparently the end of Exodus, through all of Leviticus, through basically the first 10 chapters of Numbers, that all takes place in the span of about 2 months, right? That's very condensed. And that's because it's all about God's presence coming to dwell with the people and the ramifications of that, right? If you understand that, you'll appreciate it a lot more. And then what I want you to notice is here, Numbers 33. Then Aaron the priest went up to Mount Hor at the command of Yahweh, and he died in the 40th year after the sons of Israel had come from the land of Egypt on the first day of the 5th month. So everything we've been dealing with through Exodus, Leviticus, and the first part of Numbers, that was all during a 2-year time span, right? I mean, they left Egypt in April of 1 year, and then by May of the next year, they were leaving Mount Sinai. But then you get to the end of Numbers, and all of a sudden, it's been 40 years. And Moses' brother Aaron goes and dies. And you might wonder, how the heck did we skip so much time? Why have 40 years passed? Well, that's what the book of Numbers exists to tell you, right? The book of Numbers tells you why 40 years have passed. Because it seems like that wasn't God's original plan, right? God's plan was not for them to spend 40 years in the wilderness. God's plan was for them to take over immediately. But this is what we read in Numbers chapter 14. Can I get somebody to read that for us?
I can.
Go for it.
Oh, you mean on the TV?
Yeah.
Okay. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "How long should I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? I have heard the complaints of the sons of Israel, which they are making against me. Say to them, as I live, declares Yahweh, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. Your corpses will fall in this wilderness, even all your numbered men, according to your complete number from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. Your little ones, however, who you said would become plunder, I will bring them in, so that they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in this wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness, until your corpses come to an end in the wilderness. According to the number of days when you split out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. I, Yahweh, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this evil congregation, who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to an end, and there they will die."
Perfect. Thank you.
Ouch.
Well, this seems pretty harsh. And you might be wondering what the heck happened to make God so mad. I'll tell you what happened.
Okay.
So if you remember, they were camped at Mount Sinai through Numbers chapter 10. Chapters 11 and 12, they get up and God tells them to start moving. And guess where they start heading to? where do they start heading? Where does God eventually want to lead them?
The promised land.
The promised land, right? So chapters 11 and 12, they start making their way to the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you get to Numbers chapters 13 and 14, and they're at the edge of the promised land, and so what God has Moses do is he has Moses take 12 guys, right? One from each tribe, and he sends those 12 guys into the promised land to spy it out, right? And they spend 40 days going throughout the land, surveying it, just looking at it, to bring back a report to let the people know what this land is like. Because, this is a really momentous occasion, right? I mean, God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they would receive this land 400 years earlier. And now these people are finally receiving it. Like, think about this. America has not existed that long, right? America is not even 250 years old yet, right? So that's almost 2 times the length of America. Imagine that, like, somebody came up to us and told us, like, hey, George Washington's great-great-great-grandpa, like, God gave him a promise, and you're going to be the ones to receive it. Like, that would be wild, right? And so here we are. They've arrived at the edge of the promised land. 12 spies are sent throughout the land. And when they come back, the spies are split, right? 10 of the spies are terrified. And 10 of the spies say, guys, the land is beautiful, but the people there are fearsome, right? The people there are absolutely terrifying. We don't stand a chance, right? These guys, they look like giants. They look like the Nephilim of old, right? The Nephilim, like the half angel, half man people. Like, that's what they look like. We don't stand a chance against these guys. But then there's 2 of them, right? 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, they say, we got this, right? Have you seen what God's done for us in the past? God, he delivered us from Egypt. We walked through parted waters, right? Do you remember his presence on Mount Sinai? Remember all the stuff he's done for us? We've got this. We can do it. But the people of Israel choose to obey the report of the bad spies.
Okay, so
right?
that's what happened.
And they put their trust in the bad report, and they begin to doubt God. Right? Despite all that God's done for them, they doubt him. Which the thing is, we do it too, right? It's easy for us to groan. We do the same exact thing as they do all the time, every day of our lives. But they choose to trust the bad report, and they say, man, why did God have to bring us here? Couldn't he have just left us in Egypt? And God, he's upset about this, and that's what you just read. God says, oh, really? He says, you don't think that I can bring you into the promised land? Fine. Then I'm not taking you into the promised land. I'll let you die out here in the wilderness. Maybe your kids will have a change of heart. And maybe your kids will trust me, and your kids I will bring into the promised land. Right? He says, I don't have any desire to give something to people who aren't going to trust me to give it to them. Right? I am here to give my promise to people who will trust me. And so if you're not going to, have fun in the wilderness. And so that's what he says here. Right? Surely you shall not come into the land which I swore to make you dwell, except for Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. Right? Because those are the 2 spies who trusted him. Your little ones, however, who you said would become plunder, I will bring them in, so that they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Right? So anybody who's under the age of 20 at this point, they're good to go. Right? So, if somebody's 18 years old right now, they will go into the land. Right? But anybody older than that, they're going to be here for 40 years, and most people are not living past the age of 60. Right? And so they're going to die in the wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness. Right? So the children are going to have to, this is sad. Right? The children didn't do anything wrong. It's the parents. Right? Here you've got these kids who they were supposed to be growing up in a land flowing with milk and honey. But instead, they're going to grow up in just a wilderness wasteland, a dusty desert, because their parents chose to not trust God. Because our sin doesn't just affect us. Yes. It affects others as well. Yes. Right? And so, because the parents chose not to trust God, God says, look at what you're doing to your kids. Not only are you going to die in the wilderness, but you're depriving your kids of the good gift I was going to give them. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses come to an end in the wilderness. He basically says, I'm just going to be counting down the days. Right? I'm going to wait until you die. And once you die, then I'm bringing them in. according to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt a year, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. But God is gracious here, because what's going to end up happening is that God only actually makes them wander for 38 years. Because if you remember, 2 years have already passed, right? And so they basically spent a year and a half at Mount Sinai, right? Well, a year and a half getting there and staying there, and then some extra time arriving to where they're at right now. And so God, the 40 years doesn't start here. The 40 years started when they got out of Egypt, right? But they're going to be there 40 years total. I, Yahweh, have spoken. Surely this I will do to all this evil congregation who are gathered together against me in this wilderness shall come to an end, and there they will die. So that's why 40 years pass, right? And people, I see memes about this all the time, where people, they'll have maps of, Egypt to Israel, and they're going to, do, oh my gosh, how did the people of Israel get lost for 40 years? It's not that far. It's not that they got lost for 40 years. It's that they were sentenced to 40 years of punishment. And you might wonder, well, why didn't the people of Israel just, try to go in anyways? They did, right? Immediately after this, if you read the end of Numbers 14 and going into the chapters afterwards, they try to go in. And they say, oh, crud. Well, I'm sorry, God, we really messed up. And they try to go in, and they're defeated. And God says, no, you're not going into the promised land. 40 years. And poor Moses, right? Because if you think, Moses didn't do anything wrong here, right? And if you remember this, back in Exodus 32 to 34, which we covered last week, Moses told God that he would rather live in the dusty desert with God than in the promised land without him, basically, right? It's paraphrased, but remember God had said, y'all go into the land, I'm not going with you. And Moses said, if you do not go, neither are we. Moses didn't realize it at that time, but in that moment, he actually forfeited ever getting to go into the promised land. Because Moses is already 80 years old. His brother's already 83, right? 40 years later, they're going to be 120 and 123, and that's already, that's way long. That's longer than we live, right? Back then, it was what? But Moses is not going to go into the promised land, right? He's going to die in the wilderness with the people, and so Moses doesn't I don't know. I just think that's amazing, right? But and a lot of people they will they'll say, oh, poor Moses. Right, he didn't get into the promised land. I don't think Moses had any regrets. Because Moses was never concerned about the promised land. Right? It was, let my people go that they may serve Yahweh in the wilderness. Right? It was all about serving God in the wilderness. And as long as that was accomplished, he was happy. Right? And so they get to be there 40 years in the wilderness. But that does stink for Moses because his patience is going to be tested. And that's ultimately going to be why Moses doesn't enter the promised land. Because Moses is going to make one big failure. And he's going to be punished for that. Right? Whenever the people complain about water from a rock, the people complain about lack of water, God's going to have Moses repeat a previous miracle. Right? Moses is supposed to go to a rock, and in the previous time, Moses was supposed to strike the rock, and water came out. Well, this time, God just tells Moses to speak to the rock. But Moses gets mad, and he strikes it, and he says, shall I bring forth water from this rock? And I understand where he's coming from, right? This dude has, because of these people's sins, he's stuck with them 40 years in the desert, right? He could be chilling out in Galilee, right? Oh my gosh. Ben, you've been to Galilee, right? It's beautiful,
It is.
right?
It is.
Moses could be chilling out in Galilee right now, but instead he's stuck in a desert with the most stubborn, stiff-necked people in the world,
Yes.
right? So eventually they drive him a little bit bonkers, and he's just so fed up with them that he makes one big mistake, and God says that he's not going to enter the promised land either. Right? And so Moses also is going to be punished, and he's going to die with the evil generation. Which then raises another question. Because if Moses is going to die, then what do the people of Israel need?
A leader.
They need a new leader. Moses thinks about this as well. And so Moses spoke to Yahweh, saying, may Yahweh, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who will go out and come in before them, who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of Yahweh will not be like sheep which have no shepherd. Moses is a great leader. Right? It would have been so easy for Moses to make it the Moses show. Right? He could have made it all about himself. And whenever you look at the New Testament, that's kind of what the Pharisees had done. Right? The Pharisees, man, they just talked Moses this, Moses that, Moses. And there's a temptation amongst us to do that too, right? We think of Moses and we're like, man, Moses is just the best. Moses was a very humble person, right? He was not about making things the Moses show. It was all about Yahweh. And now that he knows he is not going to go into the promised land, he says, God, the people need a leader, right? They need somebody, right? Because these people, they are like sheep. And sheep are stupid. And sheep will, they can't take care of themselves, right? There are some animals they can take care of themselves. Sheep are not those animals, right? Sheep will wander off cliffs. Sheep will just get stuck in bushes. And I mean, have you ever seen those videos of like sheep getting like stuck in like a ditch? Have y'all seen those videos? Go look them up later, right? You'll see like a sheep stuck in like this little ditch. And like you've got like a whole group of people getting the sheep out. They finally get the sheep out. 5 seconds later, the sheep just jumps right back in. Right? It's really fun. Go look it up later. It's crazy. But that's what sheep are like. And Moses says, God, that's what these people are like. He says, these people need a sheep. They need a shepherd. Right? They need a leader so that they will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Will you appoint somebody? Ironically, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is going to say the same thing. Right? Well, he's not going to say it. He's going to observe it. Right? He's going to look at the people of Israel at his time period. And despite the fact that there are Pharisees and Sadducees and all these other leaders, it says that Jesus has compassion on them because he saw that they were sheep. They were like sheep without a shepherd. And that's when he turns to his disciples and he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Right? So he says these people need a leader to guide them to God. And these Pharisees and Sadducees are not cutting it. So who is going to do it? The apostles, the disciples. Right? That's what he saw in Israel. That's what we need in our churches, right? We need people who will shepherd the flock. That's why pastors are called pastors, because the word pastor means shepherd, right? So Moses goes before God and says, God, if I'm going to die out here, the people need somebody to lead them in. They need a shepherd. So Yahweh said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him, and have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and commission him in their sight. And you shall put some of your splendor on him, in order that all the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. So God says that's what you need to do, right? Appoint Joshua. Joshua has been Moses' right-hand man this entire time, but now, once Moses dies, Joshua is going to take over the reins, and he's going to be the guy who leads them in. There is a beauty to this as well, just biblically speaking, because Moses... whenever you think of Moses, you usually associate him with the law, right? Whenever you think of Joshua, what do you think of him doing?
Fighting the people of Jericho?
The Battle of Jericho?
Well, more broader than that. The only reason we think of Joshua fighting the Battle of Jericho is because that's the story we learned as a kid. More broadly speaking, you think of Joshua leading the people into the Promised Land, right? Jericho just happens to be the first city they conquered, right? So Moses is the lawgiver, and Joshua is the one who brings the people in, right? The only thing Moses could do is he could only he could lead the people to the edge of the Promised Land where they could gaze in, but he could not bring them across. Joshua did. From a gospel perspective, this is beautiful because Joshua is the same as the name Jesus, right? If you translate it back and forth through a few languages back and forth, Joshua becomes Yehoshua, which becomes Yeshua, which becomes Jesus, right? So Joshua and Jesus, same name. Right? And if you think about Moses as the law and Joshua as the guy who leads people to the Promised Land, well, the law, it can teach you about God, and it can even help you gaze into heaven itself. But the law cannot lead you into the presence of God. Right? The only person who can lead you into the presence of God is Jesus. Right? So Moses, he's going to die with his eyes on the Promised Land, and he can see into it, but he cannot lead the people in. Same thing with the law. Right? The law can teach you how to be holy, and it can teach you how to be clean, but it cannot make you right before God. All it can do is point to the need for a sacrifice. Right? But you need Joshua to actually lead the people in. You need somebody who is able to actually go in and conquer in order to go and do it. Right? And so there is a beautiful portrait of that as well. That being said, the book of Numbers does include many different really cool stories from whenever they are in the wilderness. There's even some cool prophecies that we see whenever this guy named Balaam shows up. Balaam is an enemy to the people of Israel, but God ends up using him to bless the people of Israel. Very cool stories. For the sake of time, we're not going to cover them, but I would encourage you to go study those as well. You also have a story about like a bronze serpent, which is really neat that Jesus is going to reference. But once again, for the sake of time, we'll just skip it. And let's skip those whole 40 years, and let's get to that final year with the people of Israel camped in Moab, looking into the promised land, and we cut to the book of Deuteronomy, which I have called Moses' farewell.
All right.
Rand's happy. I can see her over there doing this.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You'll notice that I set aside an entire hour for Deuteronomy because I want to take our time going through it. We're actually going to spend most of our time looking at one single chapter, if you believe it. But the book itself deserves so much more, right? Like on Wednesday nights at church, I'm currently preaching through just 2 verses of Deuteronomy, right? We're spending like 10 weeks on 2 verses. Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Right? Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. Right? That's Deuteronomy. The way that the book of Deuteronomy is structured, actually, before I even get to that, let me just talk about the word Deuteronomy. Anybody know what Deuteronomy means?
I think it means lesson.
It does not.
Okay. That was something I remember similar to that.
Second law.
Second law. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
The word deutero means second. The prefix deutero means second. Nomos means law, right? It's Greek, right? Deuteronomos means second law. And the reason why Moses is having to deliver the second law is because, if you remember in the last book, the previous generation died, right? And so Moses is re-articulating the law and the core components of the law to a new generation, and he's also adding to that law lessons that they should have learned from their history, right?
It's like Leviticus, right?
In many ways, right? It's really kind of like a condensed version of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers.
Right.
It's more like a highlight reel,
Like a
if
summary.
anything. Yeah, it's a summary in some ways. It re-articulates certain things. And there's some ways where the law is going to change a little bit because things inherently function differently whenever you're dwelling as a camp and when you're dwelling in a land. Right? Because what Moses is preparing the people for is how are they going to be faithful once they disperse. Right? Because, I mean, if you think about it this way, it's very easy to be faithful to God whenever you're at church. It's a lot harder whenever you leave church and all the Christians go to separate places. Same thing's true for Israel. For Israel's whole history, they have been dwelling together. Right? I mean, back in the book of Genesis, Israel, it was just a family. Right? They weren't even a nation. Right? They all just lived on the same lot of land. Well, they go into Egypt where they become a nation, but they're still living in the same area because they're slaves. Well, they get out of Egypt and they go camp at Mount Sinai. And they're traveling around in a single camp where God is dwelling in the center of them. And even then, it's already hard, right? Even then, we've already seen how difficult it is for them to be faithful to God. But Moses realizes things are going to change a whole lot once they get into the land. Because now they're not going to all be camped around one another. They're going to conquer the land and they're going to disperse, right? One tribe is going to go over here. One tribe is going to go down here. One tribe is going to go up here, right? It's going to be a lot more difficult. And so in this law, Moses is re-articulating the law for a people who aren't living in the desert, but they're living in the promised land. And he's going to tell them how to be faithful to God whenever you don't have the tabernacle 200 feet away from you. Right? How do you be faithful to God whenever you don't even have, everybody 200 feet away from you? Right? How do you be faithful to God whenever you're living hills and hills and hills away from other people? Right? How do you do that? And he's also trying to teach them to learn lessons from the mistakes of their fathers. And so that leads to the structure of this. There is a past, present, and future component to the book of Deuteronomy. Chapters 1 through 4 are past. Chapters 5 through 28 are present, and chapters 29 through 34 are future. Right? Chapters 1 through 4 of the book are mainly recapping Israel's story. Right? Really starting with the Exodus story and walking through the wilderness wanderings. Moses just begins to tell them, hey, remember what happened in Egypt. Remember what happened when you walked through parted seas. Remember what happened when you got into the wilderness. Remember the golden calf. And along the way, he is teaching them lessons that they should have picked up from those incidents. He says, don't forget this. Don't forget this. Don't forget this. Don't forget this, right? And the reason why they shouldn't forget it is because
He did.
was because their parents were punished for doing what they did.
Right.
And so he says, if you forget what your parents did, I mean, what is the phrase, right? Those who forget history are doomed to
Repeat it.
repeat it, right? And so he says, remember, remember, remember. A phrase that you're going to hear throughout Deuteronomy is the word Shema, right? Hear it, right? And remember, the word Shema, to hear, it doesn't simply mean to let it go in your ears. It means to do something in response, right? So he's going to say, Shema Israel, hear, O Israel. Shema Israel, hear, O Israel. He's going to keep saying that throughout the book because he's telling them, you need to hear what I'm telling you so that you don't make the same mistakes your parents made. So chapters 1 through 4 are recapping things. Chapters 5 through 28, this is actually where he is giving the metaphorical second law, right? So at the beginning of chapter 5, guess what you read again? How did the law begin back in Exodus?
The commandments.
10 Commandments,
Yeah.
right? Well, chapter 5 opens up with Moses re-saying the 10 Commandments. Boom, 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 boom. It's almost like he's just giving the law again, right? And he says, hey, here are the 10 Commandments, right? The Bible never calls them the 10 Commandments. It calls them the 10 words, right? And so he articulates the 10 Commandments. And then you get to chapter 6, and this is where you get the stuff that I really like, because it's what I'm preaching on Wednesday, where he says, hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. And he begins to continue saying, he says, you need to take this and you need to plant it on your heart. You need to bind it around your forehead. You need to bind it on your arm. You need to put it on your doorpost so that whenever you go out and you come in, you are remembering who your God is and who you are as his people. Right? He says that's what the law is about. The law is not simply about checking off these boxes. The law is about loving God with all that you are. Right? Those 10 commandments, you're only obeying them if you're loving God with all you are. All the other commandments, you're only obeying them if you're loving God with all you are. And so he says, guys, this is what you need to do. Your entire life needs to revolve around these commandments and you need to delight in them. And so chapters 5 through 28, the majority of Deuteronomy is him just articulating the law. Right? And rather than looking backwards and rather than looking forwards, he's telling them to hear. Right? Don't look at anything. Hear what I'm saying right here, right now. In many ways, Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell speech, right? I also just realized, did I misspell farewell there? Isn't it F-A-R-E?
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
I thought that was a
It's
pun.
very fair.
No, yeah, sure. That's what it was. It was supposed to be a pun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just looked up there. I think it was probably really late at night when I made this PowerPoint. Yeah, that's supposed to be F-A-R-E. I just messed up.
I didn't even notice that until now.
I didn't even notice that until I just read it. But in many ways, Deuteronomy is Moses' farewell speech, and it is very fair. So sure, it's a pun.
All right.
We'll just roll with it. And then chapters 29 through 34, which we are going to spend most of our time on today because it actually anticipates the rest of the story, not only of the Bible, but the history of the universe, even for us today. Now that comes in those final chapters, right? 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. I want to spend most of our time on that today because if you understand Deuteronomy 32 in particular, you will understand pretty much the rest of the Bible. Right? Just that one chapter. You'll understand the rest of the Bible. Boom. Piece of cake. Right? So we're going to spend a lot of time on that today. We're going to go verse by verse through what Moses says there. But there are a few things I want to highlight in here just because they set in motion certain things that Israel is going to need to know. I already highlighted the fact that it gets a little bit more complicated whenever Israel is no longer surrounding a single campsite. Right? That just inherently makes things more complicated. And so, Moses tells the people that God has plans to help fix this. Right? Several times throughout Deuteronomy chapters 12 and chapter 16, and other chapters as well, God begins to promise that he is going to pick a place where his name is going to dwell in the land. Right? So right now, there's a central place in the camp of Israel where they can go to meet with God. Right? What is that place called?
The tabernacle.
The tabernacle, right? I mean, right now, if somebody was wanting to go offer a sacrifice to God, they would just get their sacrifice, they would go down to the tabernacle in the center of the camp, and they would offer it. Well, that's a little bit more difficult whenever you're living in a country, right? Because now you got to figure out, well, where is God going to dwell at, right? Where do I go bring my sacrifice? Well, God promises, I'm going to find a place, and I'm going to make my name dwell there. But you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your God will choose from all your tribes, to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. Then it will be that the place which Yahweh your God will choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I am commanding you. If the place where Yahweh your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you, then you may sacrifice of your herd and flock which Yahweh has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat within your gates whatever you desire. And you shall sacrifice the Passover to Yahweh your God from the flock and the herd in the place where Yahweh chooses for his name to dwell. 3 times in a year all your males shall appear before Yahweh your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, and the feast of weeks, and the feast of booths, and they shall not appear before Yahweh empty-handed. Right? So right here it specifically specifies that whenever God finds a place and chooses it for his name to dwell there, 3 times a year every male is supposed to come down and visit. 3 different festivals. The Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks. Does anybody know what that one's also called?
Feast of... Oh, wait. No.
We talked about it earlier.
Yom Kippur?
No.
Oh, yeah, I thought. Okay.
I referenced it earlier, very slightly.
That was the David Atonement.
Passover, no.
No. Feast of Weeks, it's 7 weeks after Passover.
Oh. What is it? I know.
Pentecost.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Pentecost. 7 weeks, because remember, 7 weeks is 49 days. Pentecost is 50. Right? So on Feast of Passover, they're supposed to go down. So that's like March or April. And then on the Feast of Weeks, they're supposed to go down there. Right? So that's like June, July. And then on the Feast of Booths, which is in September, October. Right? They're supposed to go down there as well. And so on those 3 feasts, every male is supposed to go down there. And God just anticipates that he is going to pick a place for his name to dwell. Ultimately, what is this place going to be?
Israel.
Well, Israel is the whole country.
Jerusalem?
Right? Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is going to be the place where God ultimately chooses. And we've been talking about this in our group that meets on Tuesdays. Why is it that God chooses Jerusalem?
Is it because it's where the temple is located?
Well, but no, the reason why the temple is there is because God chose it. But why is it that God chose it?
The Davidic covenant.
Kind of. You're almost there. To me, it's a very sweet thing.
Like because David wanted it to be there?
Yeah, it's because David chose it. Right? David chose it, and so God says, if it works for David, it works for me. Which is just really sweet. I love that. I just love the relationship between David and God. Right? Mm-hmm. David says, Jerusalem's my capital, and God says, sure, my name can dwell there. Which is really cool. And so, ultimately, that's going to be fulfilled there. And it also works out that Jerusalem is fairly central when you look at the map of Israel. And so, it kind of is kind of like the tabernacle in the center of the camp. Another thing that we see being predicted here, Deuteronomy chapter 17, is that God predicts that eventually the people are going to harden their hearts and they're going to ask for a king. Ultimately, they weren't supposed to have a king because who was supposed to be their king? God. But God does anticipate they will have a king. And so can I get somebody to read this for me?
Amen. I'll do it. When you enter the land with which Yahweh your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom Yahweh your God chooses. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your brother. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Yahweh has said to you, you shall never again return that way, and he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it will be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, to carefully observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, to the right or to the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel.
Perfect. So God predicts that they're going to harden their heart, that they're going to appoint a king, and he says, okay, I will give you a king, but there's rules. There's one thing your king is not allowed to do, right? Well, 3 things, I guess. Right? The three things he cannot do is he cannot multiply warfare, he cannot multiply women, and he cannot multiply wealth. Right? And what I mean by warfare is that he can't multiply like horses and chariots and stuff. And there seem to be reasons for this. Right? The reason why God doesn't want them to multiply horses and chariots is because he wants them to trust in him. Right? God does not need big armies, but kings typically do want big armies. Right? But God, he loves to give to people. Right? And whenever you multiply the size of your army, you're taking away fathers from their children. You're taking away sons from their parents. Right? You're taking away husbands from their families. Right? That's what happens when you multiply your army. Right? God doesn't need a huge army. And so he says, don't multiply those things. Right? I want you to trust me. Some trust in horses and chariots, but we will trust the name of God. So he says, a king cannot multiply horses and stuff like that. He doesn't need them. Right? Another thing is that a king cannot multiply wives. But the reason why is very interesting. Right? First, we know that God does not like polygamy. Right? We know that God says marriage is supposed to be between one man and one woman forever. Right? But that's not even the reason why he tells the kings to not multiply wives here. Right? He actually just highlights that if he does multiply wives, these wives are most likely going to turn his heart away. Because God understands that if a king is multiplying wives, it's not simply because he is lustful. Because if he was lustful, he wouldn't have to marry these girls, right? Kings are kings. They can do whatever they want with whoever they want. If he is marrying them, it's probably because there's some sort of political advantage to the marriage, in which case he's probably marrying foreign women who worship foreign gods. And so he says they can't multiply wives either because they will lead your heart astray. And then, third thing, can't multiply wealth. Right? The reason you can't multiply wealth is because if the king is multiplying wealth for himself, who is he usually taking that wealth away from?
From the people.
From the people, right? Usually it comes in the forms of taxes, or it just shows that the king is serving himself more than he is serving the people. Right? So if the king is getting abnormally rich, it shows that something is wrong. Right? Especially if there's poor people in the land. Right? It shows that the king is in some way not serving the people and he's indulging himself. And so God says these three things are not allowed if you appoint a king. Instead, what the king should do is he should create a law, like he should make a hand copy of the law so he can study it day and night. Right? He should have his own copy so that he can have it sitting on his bedside and at any given moment he can read it. Right? That's what the king should do. And that's the rule. So, the main reason I highlight this is because whenever kings start popping up in the land of Israel, this is the criteria by which we're supposed to judge them, right? Are they multiplying warfare? Are they multiplying women? Are they multiplying wealth, right? Whenever they do those things, red flag, red flag, red flag, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing worth highlighting here, Moses mentions it in Deuteronomy chapter 18, and we read about it again in chapter 34. We'll talk about the 34 thing later on. Moses predicts that another prophet like him is going to show up. Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. You shall listen to him. This is according to all that you asked of Yahweh your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of Yahweh my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die. If you remember God spoke the 10 Commandments, and the people of Israel said, you know what, we don't want to talk with God directly, let's have a mediator. Right? We want a prophet. And so, going forward from that moment, God does not speak directly to the people. Right? It seems like that was really one of the only clear moments where God spoke to the people. And now, going forward, God speaks through prophets. And so Moses predicts, you're going to have prophets sent to you, but there's going to be one prophet in particular who is like me. And Yahweh said to me, they have spoken well. I'll raise up a prophet from among their brothers like you, and I will put my words in his mouth. He shall speak to them that I command him. And it will be that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So Moses predicts that there is going to be this future prophet who shows up who is like him. Some might think, oh, well, this is Joshua. But when you read Deuteronomy 34, it says, and there has not yet arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face, in regard to all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land, and in regard to all the mighty power, and in regard to all the great terror which Moses did in the sight of all Israel. That's how the book of Deuteronomy ends. And so by the end of the book of Deuteronomy, even though Joshua has taken over, the person who's writing this final chapter says, that prophet still hasn't shown up. And so Moses predicts that this future prophet is going to arise, and the rest of Scripture, we're waiting for him, right? And so now not only are we waiting for this Messiah figure to show up, right, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, but we're also waiting for this prophet guy. And one thing that we're going to see people struggling with, especially in the New Testament times, is they're trying to figure out whether or not this prophet is the same as the Messiah, right? Are they separate people, or are they, like, is the Messiah prominent? Like, is he primarily a prophet? Is he primarily a king? Is he a priest? What's the Messiah going to be, right? People are going to be wrestling through this stuff. And so that's another thing to be lingering on, which then leads us to the thing that I really want to focus on for the majority of the rest of the night. Deuteronomy 32. Right? Like I mentioned, once you get to chapters 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, Moses shifts and he begins to look forward in Israel's history, and he begins to tell them how things are going to go going forward. Probably one other thing worth highlighting, chapters 27 and 28, Moses does basically lay down exactly how, like, the covenant's going to go between them and God. That's probably not something worth just like skipping over. If you read those chapters 27 and 28 of Deuteronomy, Moses literally just says, okay, if you obey God, you will be blessed in the land. If you disobey God, you will be cursed in the land. Right? If you disobey God, once again, it's not about salvation. It's simply about how things go for them in the land. Right? And so if they are disobedient, and if they follow after their gods, and if they cheat on God, well, then God is going to seal up the heavens and it will not rain. And if they still don't repent, eventually he's going to send warfare. And if they still don't repent, eventually he's going to destroy them. And he's going to send them into exile. And he's going to do this and that and this and that. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Right? So that's part of the covenant agreement. And then, once you get to Deuteronomy chapters 29 through 34, Moses shifts and he begins to, as a prophet, predict what's going to happen to them in their future. And in Deuteronomy 32, Moses gives what is one of the coolest prophecies in the entire Bible, where he literally lays out, play by play, what is going to happen to the people of Israel all the way until the end of times. And so we're going to go through this verse by verse.
All right.
Let me actually read the opening words of this, because I didn't put them on here. Yeah, actually, maybe I did. Let me just check real quick. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Actually, let me read the end of chapter 31. So, it says, Deuteronomy 31, verse 24, "It came about when Moses finished writing the words of this law in a book until they were complete, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, saying, 'Take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of Yahweh your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stubbornness. Behold, while I am still alive with you today, you have been rebellious against Yahweh. How much more then after my death? Assemble to me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I might speak these words in your hearing and call the heavens and the earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn from the way which I have commanded you. And evil will befall you in the latter days, for you will do that which is evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger with the work of your hands.'" Safe to say, Moses knows the people really well, and he does not predict that things are going to go very well with them. Right? He hears the people saying, "We will follow Yahweh. We will follow Yahweh." He knows they're not going to do it, though. Right? He knows the heart of man. He knows it's deceptively wicked. He knows that it's sick, sinful. And so he says, "Guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a song. And I'm going to write this song down so that in the future, whenever you disobey God and you do all the things that I predicted, this song will testify against you. And not only am I writing it for your sake, I'm writing it so that the heavens and the earth themselves will be able to testify against you." Whenever he uses the phrase heavens and earth, what does that make you think of?
Just one.
Genesis 1, creation. Right? He says, I don't simply want y'all to hold each other accountable. Creation itself will hold you accountable for this. "Then Moses spoke in the hearing of all the assembly of Israel the words of this song until they were complete." Right? So you can imagine Moses standing before the people. They have just said, "We will follow Yahweh." And then he says, "Let me tell you what you're actually going to do." This is how the song goes. "Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak. and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Let what I have learned drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, as the droplets on the fresh grass and as the showers on the herb. For I proclaim the name of Yahweh. Ascribe greatness to our God. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. So what Moses is going to do is he's going to begin walking through Israel's history from beginning to end. Starting in Genesis, going all the way to Revelation.
So it is a summary.
It is. He's literally summarizing it, right? And so Genesis 1 begins with the phrase, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So who does Moses speak to? Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Right? He speaks to God's creation and tells creation itself to listen to what he's about to say. Let what I have learned drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, as the droplets on the fresh grass and as the showers on the herb. He says, I hope that these words fall like dew upon the ground and that they soak into creation so that creation never forgets them. Right? I hope that these words are not lost to anybody because they are essential. For I proclaim the name of Yahweh. Ascribe greatness to our God. So he says, yes, I'm going to predict Israel's history, but what I'm doing this for is because I am proclaiming how amazing Yahweh is. And he gives a name to Yahweh here. He calls him the rock. Right? In Hebrew, it's the word Sur. This is one of the first times that Yahweh is called the rock, but he is going to be called this throughout the rest of Scripture. Right? And whenever he is called this, it is almost always alluding back to this chapter. His work is perfect, all his ways are just. Right? A God of faithfulness and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. So he says, let me clarify. What you're about to read is not going to sound very good, but none of it is God's fault. Right? God, he is perfect, just, faithful, without injustice, righteous and upright. He's all those things. All the bad stuff comes from Israel. So, summary, Moses calls for all creation to soak in the words of his song as he proclaims the name of Yahweh the rock, his faithfulness, justice, and uprightness. And he's going to demonstrate God's faithfulness and uprightness and righteousness through Israel's unfaithfulness, unrighteousness, and wickedness. Right? That's how he's going to demonstrate it. Right? God's faithfulness is demonstrated by being faithful to unfaithful people. He continues. They have acted corruptly toward him. Who is they? Israel. Right? They have acted corruptly toward him. They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and crooked generation. Do you thus repay Yahweh, O people who are wickedly foolish and without wisdom? Is not he your father who has bought you? He has made you and established you. Right? So, despite Yahweh's faithfulness, Israel has been unfaithful and corrupt to him. So he says, this is who Israel is. Right? All God has done for them, and how do they respond? They act corruptly. Right? And we've already seen this several times. I mean, just go through the story. Right? Abraham. God says, go down to this land and I'm going to give you all this stuff. Abraham goes down there, then he goes down to Egypt and lies about whether or not his wife is actually his wife. Right? On several times, Abraham messes up. Isaac messes up too. Jacob messes up as well. Moses himself messes up. Right? Israel's history is of constant failure and constant corruption despite God's faithfulness. Yet God has not abandoned them. Right? And so he says, this is who we are. Right? We are the God wrestlers. Right? God keeps on giving and we keep wrestling back. Remember the ancient days. Consider the years from generation to generation. Ask your fathers, and he will declare to you. Your elders, and they will speak to you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So Moses begins his recap and commands Israel to remember their history. Right? Remember the ancient days. Right? I mean, he's talking to a modern generation, but he's telling them to remember stuff from well before they were here. Right? The ancient days, right? Hundreds of years ago. Remember the ancient days. Consider the years from generation to generation. Right? So he says, I don't want you to be the only one to consider this. I want every generation of Israelites to consider this. From generation to generation, I want you to remember these words. If you don't remember it, ask your father. He'll declare it to you. Your elders, they'll speak it to you. If you forgot history, somebody's got to remember it. So go ask them about it. What exactly does he want them to remember? Well, he says, let's start right here. when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. What's he talking about there? When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. What story is that referencing?
Tower of Babel.
Yeah, it's referencing Tower of Babel, right? When he gave the nations their inheritance, right? So whenever everybody was together, God split them up and they all went to their apportioned place. Well, that's Genesis chapters 10 and 11, right? The Tower of Babel story is what this is referencing. So at that moment, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, right? So he divided them. You remember that story, right? He set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. There is one place here where I think the translation is bad, right? It says sons of Israel, and many of your translations might say the same thing. Probably a better translation is sons of God. The reason why it says Israel is because that is what our Hebrew manuscripts say. But almost all of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts that we have of this say sons of God. And whenever the New Testament makes reference to it, it seems to interpret it as sons of God. And pretty much all, at least first century Jews, seem to read it this way, right? And so I would actually argue that sons of God is probably the more correct thing here. It's just that there's a variation here. According to the number of sons of Israel, the reason why it says that is because whenever you read the Tower of Babel story and stuff like that in the Table of Nations, you'll notice that there are 70 different nations that are listed, and there are 70 people belonging to the family of Israel when they go into Egypt, right? The reason why that doesn't really hold up, though, is because at the time period of Babel, Israel did not exist, right? And so it seems kind of weird that God would just arbitrarily say, okay, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, let's just pick 70 people, right? Like, people, like, in order to defend the sons of Israel position, people basically have to, like, kind of pull at straws. Whereas sons of God makes more sense, because whenever it says the sons of God, what is it probably referring to? If you have, like, a Genesis chapter 6 in mind.
Angels.
Not necessarily angels, but Elohim, right? Elohim, the gods, right? The other members of the divine council, right? So other unseen spiritual beings, right, who are not humans. Now, most likely this is what it means, right? So whenever God divided the nations, he basically gave each nation their God, right? And so, the people split up, and they each were given an Elohim to preside over them, right? Basically, it's like, okay, God said, okay, well, this is how many we've got here. Okay, you are going to be in charge of them, you're going to be in charge of them, you're going to be in charge of them. Some of these Elohim presumably rebelled, right? And they chose to do things their own way, and that's how you end up getting like the pagan gods who are like leading the people astray, right? And so this seems to be the worldview that's being established here, because God is the Elohim of Elohims, right? He is the uncreated creator of all things, right? But there are other Elohim, there's other beings that he has appointed, and each nation had their God. But Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. Right? So all the other nations had their gods. But Yahweh, the God of gods, he chose Israel. Right? Do you see why why Moses would emphasize this? He says God could have picked anywhere. Right? He could have chosen to be the God of Assyria. He could have chosen to be the God of Egypt. He could have chosen to be the God of South Dakota. But he didn't. He chose Jacob. He chose Israel. Right? Way back then, at the Tower of Babel, he decided, Israel will be mine. That was Genesis chapter 11. What do you read about Genesis chapter 12?
Abraham and covenant.
Yeah, he says, Abraham, get up and go to this land. I'm going to give it to you. Right? And so, now it makes sense, right? You go Genesis 11, Genesis 12. Yeah. Right? God chose Israel. And so, what does he do? He starts establishing Israel. Right? And so, at Babel, Yahweh gave each nation their inheritance, but he chose Israel as his portion. Right? He could have picked anybody, but for some reason he elected Israel. Right? The word election is really important there as well, because in the New Testament it'll use the word election a lot to describe the people of Israel. He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of a wilderness he encircled him. He cared for him. He guarded him as the pupil of his eye, the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young, he spread his wings and caught them. He carried them on his pinions. Yahweh alone guided him, and there was no foreign god with him. Yahweh alone, no other god, found Israel in dusty desert and guided him into a new land. And already we've seen this multiple times in Israel's history, right? Abraham, right? Immediately after Tower of Babel, what does he do? He comes to Abraham living in Ur of the Chaldeans, a desert area, and he says, arise, and I will give you this land flowing with milk and honey, right? So he comes to him in a desert wasteland, and he brings them into a plentiful land. He found him in a desert land, in the howling waste of the wilderness, encircled him, cared for him, guarded him as the pupil of his eye. Right? I will bless those who bless you. Those who do not, I will curse. Well, we'll see that with the Exodus generation as well. Right? He found them in the desert, and he took them out of Egypt. Right? He encircled them. He took them out of Egypt and began to guide them towards the promised land, but they rejected him. Right? And so they ended up stuck in the wilderness. But then again, he comes to them in the wilderness, and he begins to guide them to the promised land. Right? So already we've seen this same thing play out 3 times. Right? It's the repetition of it, right? He finds them in a desert wasteland. He encircles them. He guides them in. He spread his wings. He caught them, carried them on his pinions. The idea is that God is the one doing all the work. Right? Did they have to raise a sword against the Egyptians? No. The Red Sea did the work for them. Right? Moses is the one who had to lift up his arm in that battle. Right? For them, they just had to be faithful. Right? And so God is the one doing the heavy lifting. All they have to do is follow. And he says, Yahweh alone guided him. There was no foreign god with him. Even when you tried to make other gods, those gods weren't with you. It was Yahweh. Right? Yahweh picked you from nothing, and he's guided you all along this way. No other god did that for you. And so he's telling them to remember that. Right? Remember that he picked you out of nothing. He took you from nothing. He made you everything, and no other god did any of that stuff for you. Right? It was Yahweh alone. He made him ride on the high places of the earth. And he ate the produce of the field. And he made him suck honey from the rock and oil from the flinty rock. Curds of cows and milk of the flock, with fat of lambs and rams and the breed of Bashan, and goats, with finest of wheat. And the blood of grapes you drank wine. So in many ways, this calls back to Abraham, but it also begins to call forward. Right? You begin to see the transition. Right? So he says he took them from the dusty desert and he brings them into a land flowing with milk and honey, and he provides for them. Well, we saw that with Abraham, right? I mean, Abraham's whole story was like, no matter what happened to Abraham, he just started getting richer and richer and richer, and he was just like overflowing with how much he had, right? Like this dude was just doing great to where he would sin against people, and those people would end up giving him gifts, right? So we saw that with Abraham, but we're going to see it again as we go forward, right? So right here in these verses, we begin to see this transition where we were looking at the past of Israel's history and we begin to anticipate what's going to happen, right? So God has come and found them in the wilderness, and he's going to take them into the promised land, right? He made them ride on the high place of the earth. He ate the produce of the land. He made them suck honey from the rock, the oil from the flinty rock. You can see how this might kind of allude to what God has done for them in the wilderness, right? How they drank water from a rock, stuff like that. Well, he says, you haven't seen anything yet. You're going to be drinking honey from the rock soon, right? Because he's going to take you to a place flowing not with just water, but flowing with milk and honey, right? Curds of cows, milk of the flock, the fat of lambs, the best of the best. God has got that plan for you, and you're going to have that. But notice he's speaking it in past tense. This is what prophets will do, right? It's called the prophetic past tense, right? To where it's like Moses is looking so far into the future that even future events look like the past to him, right? So he sees what's going to happen, but he says, yeah, God did that for you, right? Isaiah's going to do the same thing when he predicts about Jesus, right? Surely he has borne our griefs, right? Like a lamb before its sheepers was silent, he opened not his mouth, right? He was a man of sorrows, right? So like Isaiah is going to look to the future, but he's going to see what Jesus did as if it was in the past. We'll move forward. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. Jeshurun is just a fancy term for Israel. It means the righteous one, and it's being used here ironically, right? So they're called the righteous one, but they're not acting very righteous. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, thick, and sleek. Then he abandoned God who made him and treated the rock of his salvation with wicked foolishness. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons who were not God, to gods whom they have not known, new gods who came lately, whom your fathers did not dread. You neglected the rock who begot you. and forgot the God who brought you forth. So what does Moses predict is going to happen once they get into the promised land and once God gives them the land flowing with milk and honey?
They're going to turn away from him. They're
Yeah.
going to forget who gave them all of the plentiful things that they have, and they're just going to indulge in it and just kind of leave God in the dust.
Yeah. The word indulge is the perfect word for this, right? Rather than responding in gratitude, Israel responded in entitlement and self-indulgence. They became obese in their prosperity and began to worship other gods. And this isn't going to happen just once. It's going to happen over and over and over again, right? And it even begins to happen before they get into the promised land, right? I mean, as soon as they got into the wilderness, God provided, and what did they do? They started indulging. Remember that with the manna? Right? God said, only get the amount of manna that I've prescribed to you. And they gather more. He says, don't get manna on the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath day, they get up to go gather manna. Right? So he's providing for them, but they're indulgent. Right? They feel entitled to this stuff. And whenever God is not providing how they want, they say, we wish we were back in Egypt. Why doesn't God just kill us? Right? They should be grateful, but instead they're entitled and they're self-indulgent. And they begin to get obese. And Moses says, the same thing is going to happen when you get into the land. Right? God is going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey, and rather than being grateful and rather than worshiping God for it, you're just going to turn away from him.
And just kind of like abuse the blessings.
Exactly. Right? It's kind of like a person who's in a marriage that is so great that they decide to just go add some drama by cheating on the person. Right? It's like what? Like, what? Why would you do this? It's like, oh, my wife was just too sweet and too nice all the time. I needed to, like, add some flavor. It's like, what? No, it's ridiculous. But that's what Israel's going to do. Right? And so, whenever they're at the height of their prosperity, they're going to turn away from God. Which, I will highlight, is what we do too. Right? Usually that's whenever we are at the height of, like, whenever life is going great, be careful because sin is usually crouching around the door.
Yeah.
Right? Like, usually whenever you are at the height of prosperity and everything feels like it's fantastic, that's when sin is right there.
It's a very responsible moment, you know?
Exactly. So he says, Jeshurun grew fat and kicked, right? They were feeling so good about what God had given them that they decided to rebel. It's kind of like, have y'all seen Harry Potter? You know Dudley Dursley?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's what Israel's like, right? Just this spoiled, rotten child who has no gratitude and feels entitled to everything. Been fed with a silver spoon, and the difference is that Dudley Dursley was mainly like that because his parents made it possible.
Yeah.
God, he was being gracious, and he's giving them warnings. But they're not learning from them.
Wow.
Right? And so they make him jealous with strange gods. With abomination, they provoked him to anger. Right? They're just going to start worshiping other gods. We're going to see this at first whenever they go into the promised land, and we get immediately to the time period of the judges. Right? They are going to rebel against God, and they're going to start worshiping other gods. And it's like, what? Right? I just gave you all this stuff, and you rebelled against me. It makes no sense, but that's what they're going to do. Right? You neglected the rock who begot you and forgot the God who brought you forth. Right? I mean, God, like, that's crazy. Right? Yahweh is the God of creation. Right? He hasn't forgotten them, even though they're this tiny little nation. He could have picked anybody. And these people have they could have been stuck with one of the other gods. But they were given the God of gods. Yet they decided to abandon him to chase after, like, a lesser god. Right? And it says they provoked him to gods that they hadn't even known. And new gods who came lately. He's like, these aren't even the ones I appointed over the nations. Right? These are just, like, made up people. Right? They're not even actual gods. They're just, like, figments of your own imagination. You just, like, made a golden calf and decided to call it God. Like, it's not even real. And so he's offended by this. And they're going to do the same thing in the monarchy as well. Right? Because Solomon is going to bring them to the height of prosperity, and what are they going to do? Turn from God. Right? Multiply wealth, multiply warfare, multiply women. Right? All that's going to happen. So he's looking forward, and he's predicting what's going to happen. It's just an endless cycle. And Yahweh saw this and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and daughters. Then he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be. For they are a perverse generation, sons in whom is no faithfulness. There's going to be 3 punishments that God goes about here. Right? 3 things that he's going to do, and it's going to be repeated again and again and again. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to hide his face from them. Right? Yahweh resolves to hide himself from Israel all as a means of bringing about his end plans for them. We're going to see this in the book of the prophets, right? So whenever the people begin to turn away from God, Isaiah is going to be called, and Isaiah says, what am I supposed to do? And God says, you're going to preach to a people who do not hear, so that though they have eyes, they will not see, and though they have ears, they will not hear, right? And so the prophets are intentionally cryptic because God is hiding himself from Israel, right? Because they have rejected him, he is going to reject them, and he's going to make it harder for them to hear him, right? So that's going to happen there. We're going to see this also take place whenever ultimately the Old Testament comes to an end, right? Whenever the people have kind of rejected God, they've come back from exile, they haven't fully learned their lesson. What's God going to do? Go radio silent for 400 years. And then again, when you get to the New Testament, Jesus is going to begin to do this, right? God in the flesh is going to come down to them, and whenever he shows up, he's going to preach to them. He's going to primarily focus on the children of Israel, but they're going to reject him. So what does he begin to teach in? Parables. Yeah. And so because they reject him, he begins to teach in parables, and the disciples ask, why are you doing this? And he says, so that having eyes they will not see, and so that having ears they will not hear. He's going to quote the book of Isaiah, right? And so that's punishment number one. Whenever Israel rebels against God, he begins to hide himself from them, right? It's no wonder that whenever Solomon turns from God, all of a sudden more prophets start showing up on the scene, right? It's because God is beginning to hide himself from Israel. Punishment number two. This is where it gets really cool for us. They have made me jealous with what is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are not a people. I'll provoke them to anger with a wickedly foolish nation. For a fire is kindled in my anger, and it burns to the lowest part of Sheol. And it consumes the earth with its produce, and it sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. All right? Well, what does God resolve to do?
He uses other people to try and get to turn the Israelites back to him, and that's us.
Yep. This is eye for eye justice, right? God says, all right, if you're going to make me jealous with what is not a God, I'll make you jealous with what is not a people. Right? Okay, well, you know who's not a people? The rest of the world. Right? Literally anybody but the Jews. Right? They're not one people, they're all the people. So he said, I picked you as the apple of my eye, but if you don't want me, then I'll go to anybody else. Right? Right there, the Hebrew word for nation there is the Hebrew word goy. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, it is the Greek word ethnos, which is what we usually translate as nations or as Gentiles. Right? Because the word Gentile just means nation. Right? And so whenever Jesus, at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, says, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, in Greek it's ethnos. Right? He is directly fulfilling this. Right? Because he came to Israel and they rejected him. So what does he do? Like Matthew chapter 10 and 11, he tells the disciples, hey, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. Now go to the sons of Israel and preach. But expect persecution. Chapter 28, he says, go and make disciples of the Gentiles. So this is punishment number two. Right? And we see this once again throughout the scriptures. Right? We see this, we just talked about this recently in 1 Kings. Right? So whenever Ahab does not listen to Elijah, Elijah hides himself. Right? Punishment number one. And then the second thing that he does, he goes to Zarephath. And he begins to minister to a widow in Zarephath, which is a Gentile region, it's Sidonian. Right? And so God does this, right? If Israel will not reject him, the God of Israel will go to the Gentiles. This affects us even to this day, right? And this is what, like in the book of Romans, Paul says this is why the Gentiles are such a prominent part of the church, because God is making Israel jealous, right? He said, think about that. That's so weird, right? There are two different religions right now I guess Islam as well, but there are really two primary religions that claim to worship the God of Israel. That's the Jews and the Christians. Guess which one of those groups is bigger? Christians. And the Jews don't like that. They're like, what? No. You can't say that you worship our God. Yeah. But it's to make them jealous, right? That's the whole point. Right? And so we believe that God has a plan for the people of Israel, but right now he's making them jealous. Right? He is trying to provoke them to jealousy so that eventually they'll come back to him. And that's why we should pray for the Jewish people. Right? We should pray that they will eventually come back. And we know that they will, but unfortunately, we don't see it happening until the book of Revelation. So they made me jealous with what is not a God. They provoked me to anger with their idols. I will make them jealous with those who are not a people. We also see it happening in the Gospels as well, where Jesus, he goes and he preaches to the Jews, but then after they reject him more, he begins to minister more to Gentiles. Right? He ministers to a Syrophoenician woman. He goes and he did the feeding of the 5,000 with Jews. He does the feeding of the 4,000 with Gentiles. Right? He begins to start turning towards the Gentiles, and then finally the gospel ends up going to the Gentiles. Right? The beginning of the book of Acts, take the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. Do you know what takes the gospel from Jerusalem to Judea? Like, what marks the shift from the gospel being in Judea to Samaria? Persecution. Well, it's persecution, right? A guy named a guy named Saul begins persecuting the church, and so the gospel goes from Judea to Samaria. The Jews rejecting the gospel leads the gospel away. And then eventually, the reason why the gospel goes from Samaria to the ends of the earth is because a guy named Herod has one of the apostles put to death, right? So you've got Jews rejecting the gospel goes to the Gentiles, right? And so the reason why all of us are sitting in this room right now is because God is so faithful to the Jews, he's trying to make them jealous. That's punishment number 2. I will heap calamities on them. I will exhaust my arrows on them. They will be wasted by famine and consumed by plague and bitter destruction. And the teeth of beasts I will send upon them, with venom crawling things of the dust. Outside the sword will bereave, and inside terror, both choice man and virgin, the nursing baby with the man of gray hair. Punishment number 3 is that Yahweh will employ Gentile nations to afflict Israel as punishment for their rebellion. Part 1, hide his face. Part 2, go to the Gentiles. Part 3, employ the Gentiles to destroy Israel. That's going to happen throughout the Bible, right? So because Israel rejects God, he is going to send the Assyrians to afflict them. The northern kingdom of Israel is going to be destroyed. The southern kingdom is going to be spared because they repent. But the southern kingdom is going to turn away from him again, so he's going to send the Babylonians to do it, right? And so he sends Gentiles to afflict Israel. Same thing's going to happen in the Gospels, right? Jesus has been rejected by his people, and so towards the end of the Gospels, he stands on the Mount of Olives and he looks into Jerusalem and he predicts that one day that place is going to be leveled because the Romans are going to come in and they are going to destroy Jerusalem, right? And so it's the same thing again and again, right? As Moses looks forward, he says, those are the 3 things God's going to do. First, he's going to hide his face. Secondly, he's going to go to the Gentiles. Thirdly, he's going to employ Gentiles to destroy Israel, right? And these are all acts of judgment for their rebelling against him. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will cause the memory of them to cease from men, had I not feared the provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries misjudge, lest they say, our hand is triumphant and Yahweh has not done all this. So God says, you know what? I am so mad by what Israel's doing that I want to just destroy them. But there's one thing that's staying him. He says, I don't want the Gentiles to get the wrong message. Yahweh would destroy Israel, but he resolves to spare them for the sake of the Gentiles, lest they triumph and fail to see his role in Israel's discipline. Right? If the Assyrians just totally wipe out the northern kingdom, if the Babylonians just totally wipe out the southern kingdom, if the Romans just totally destroy all of Israel, they're going to think, look how powerful we are. But instead, here we are 2,000 years after the New Testament, and Israel still exists. And it still can't be destroyed. So God says, I would destroy them because they deserve it, but for the sake of the Gentiles, I'm not going to. Because I don't want the Gentiles to think that they have that much power. He says, I'm going to destroy them and afflict them for their evil, but there's always going to be a remnant, right? There's always going to be a faithful remnant that survives as a testimony to the Gentiles that the only reason they were even able to afflict Israel was because I allowed them to. And the reason why Israel exists is because Yahweh is the God of Israel, and he is faithful to his promises. Right? And so, but it's interesting. God goes to the Gentiles for the sake of the Jews, but he spares the Jews for the sake of the Gentiles. Right? So he's got both in mind in all of this. For they are a nation where counsel perishes, and there is no discernment in them. Would that they were wise, that they had insight into this, that they would understand their future. How could one pursue 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight? unless the rock had sold them and Yahweh had handed them over. So despite being foretold their future, Israel won't comprehend it when it unfolds. They, not their oppressors, are their own greatest enemy. Their oppressors would not succeed unless Yahweh allowed them to do so. So here, Yahweh voices frustration. They're a nation where counsel perishes, right? Like Moses is literally saying, guys, I am literally telling you word for word what's going to happen in your history. Yet when it happens, you're not going to understand it. Whenever the Assyrians show up, you're going to think that Assyria is your problem. When the Babylonians show up, you're going to think the Babylonians are your problem. But they're not your problem. If Jerusalem lies in ashes, it's not because the Babylonians were your enemy. It's because you were your own greatest enemy. You should have repented. Whenever Jesus shows up, do you know why they reject Jesus?
Because...
What were they expecting?
A conquering king.
They expected a conquering king because they thought their greatest need was for the Romans to be destroyed. But the fact that the Romans were oppressing them testified to the fact that they were their own enemy, right? They didn't need a king who would conquer Rome. They needed a king who would conquer their sin, right? That's what they needed. But they failed to understand that, right? They wanted a king to go out and conquer the Romans because of exactly what Moses says here. Moses says, your counsel perishes. I'm literally telling you what's going to happen in your history, yet you're not going to get it when it happens. The Romans are going to come in, and you're going to think, if only we could kick out the Romans, everything would be good. No, the reason the Romans are here is because you're the problem, and you need to repent, but you're not going to get it, right? How could one pursue 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them and Yahweh had handed them over? He says, guys, don't you know the law? He says, according to the law, if you're faithful, one of you will put 10,000 people to flight. If one of them is putting 10,000 of you to flight, that means the issue is you. Because that means that Yahweh is not protecting you right now. Yes?
Okay, so, clarification.
Okay.
Or it's not a clarification, but... So, Moses is telling them the future, right? Would it have been possible for them to change after he would have told them the future, or probably not, right? Because...
Well, he's just saying they're not going to, because they're not listening.
It's basically the same thing as the free will thing versus God's will, right?
I mean, they have free will, they're just not going to choose it. Like, he just
knows. It's like that question of what came first, right? It's like that kind of thing. I'm getting at that.
Not quite, because the thing is, all because God knows what's going to happen doesn't mean he's forcing them, right? He knows what's going to happen, so he knows they're not going to, like, he knows that they're going to harden their heart. Like, and that's what Moses is predicting.
What possesses them to do that?
Sinful.
Oh.
Yeah, they're just sinful. Right? So Moses, like, hypothetically, they could, but Moses knows they're not going to. Right? Moses is predicting, he says, this is what's going to happen. Right? And the reason why he's doing this is to warn them, but he knows they're not going to heed the warning. But whenever they don't heed the warning and these things happen, this serves as a testimony to, once again, all creation. Right? So we, as Gentiles, can read this, and we can understand exactly what's happening. Right? So that we can learn from their mistake. And then hopefully, for the Jews who do have ears to hear, they will read it and say, that was what the issue was. Right? And so he says, guys, if you're being run off by the Romans, and if they're winning, if the Babylonians are triumphing over you, it's not because you need a bigger army. It's because you've abandoned God. Right? So you need to get back to him. Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. For their vine is the vine of Sodom, and their fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. Their wine is the venom of serpents, and their deadly poison of cobras. History proves that the gods of the Gentiles cannot compare to Israel's God. If the Gentiles are victorious, it is only because Yahweh has allowed them to be. He says, do you not remember Sodom and Gomorrah? Right? God just snapped his fingers, and Sodom and Gomorrah went up in flames. Do you not remember walking through parted waters? God blew from his mouth, and Egypt's armies were drowned. He says, their gods are not like our gods. If you are losing battles, that is not because you need a bigger army. It is because you need to turn back to God. But you're not going to learn that, right? They're going to think, oh, look at us. You know, they're just not going to get it, right? They're going to have like a more victim mentality about it. And they're going to say, oh, we need to trust in all these other people. No, he says, just get back to God. Is it not laid up in store with me, sealed in my treasuries? Vengeance is mine and retribution. In due time their foot will stumble. For the day of their disaster is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. For Yahweh will render justice to his people and will have compassion on his slaves when he sees that their strength is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. So he says that this mystery is stored up in Yahweh's treasuries, right? Is it not laid up in store with me, sealed up in my treasuries? Interestingly enough, whenever Paul references the mystery of God in the New Testament, almost every single time he is referring to the fact that God had a plan for the Gentiles in the midst of his plan for the Jews. Right? That Gentiles in some mysterious way were going to be welcomed into the fold of God. Right? Same thing's being referenced here. And in fact, in the book of Romans, Paul's going to quote this entire passage when he's talking about how God has left the Jews to bring in the Gentiles to make the Jews jealous. So he's going to quote Deuteronomy 32 several times. He will pay back Israel's enemies for afflicting them, and he only punishes Israel because he has a plan to bring them back to him. He'll let them be brought to near destruction, and then we'll save them. So he says, guys, vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. He says, if the Romans are oppressing you, you don't need to be concerned with paying back the Romans. I will handle that in due time. Right? If the Babylonians are at your doorstep, you don't need to worry about fighting the Babylonians. I will handle that. Vengeance is mine. What you need to do is get your act together and repent. Right? And that's what Jesus came to do, right? They rejected him because they wanted a king who would fight the Romans, and Jesus says, that's not what you need. You need a king who will help you repent. And so Jesus laid his life down to be a sacrifice. Right? Like that's like if you understand Deuteronomy 32, you'll understand the gospel. Right? Because they had the wrong understanding, right? The mystery was laid up in the treasuries of God. And that's why Paul says the mystery of God has been revealed to the apostles. Right? Because the Christians, the leaders of the Christian, like they're the ones who understood it. Right? They were the Jews who came to Christ. So he says he is going to allow them to be afflicted and beaten down until they are almost nothing. And then finally they'll cry out to him, and then he will save them. And he will say, where are their gods, the rock which they sought refuge? Who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offering? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your hiding place. Sounds very similar to what we covered in 1 Kings last week, huh? See now that I am he. There is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. Yahweh will force Israel into a position where all their other gods will fail them. Then at long last they will look upon him, the rock whom they rejected, and will finally come back to him. In the book of Revelation, you see this happen. God sets apart 144,000 Jews to be sealed and saved during the time of trouble. And then finally the Lamb of God descends from heaven with a trumpet sound. And whenever they see him, the next time you see the 144,000 Jews, they're standing behind Jesus. Because finally, when their hope is lost, they see the one whom they have pierced, and they say, there he is. Right? So finally they'll realize the God that they've spurned, and they will come back to him. Right? So it ends very triumphant, but it says it's going to get really bad before it gets better. Right? The Jews are going to reject God, but eventually the rock that they rejected will become the cornerstone. Right? And this is something that we read throughout Scripture. Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven. I love this. Yahweh himself is swearing. Like this imagery is great. And this imagery is picked up in the book of Revelation as well. Revelation chapter 10, go read it. Really cool. Right? Yahweh himself swears an oath. Right? Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will render vengeance on my adversaries. I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives for the long-haired leaders of the enemy. So God says, I promise you right now, judgment will come. And judgment will come against those people who oppress you. But first, I need to bring you back to me. In the book of Revelation, you see an angel standing with 1 foot on the water, 1 foot on the sea. 1 foot in the sea, 1 foot on the land. He makes basically the same exact promise. And then the Son of God descends. The 144,000 stand behind him. And then he brings out his sickle. And he begins chopping people down. Right? It's the day of wrath. Right? And so it's exactly what we see being predicted right here. So it's going all the way to Revelation, to the end of days, whenever finally the time of the hardening of the Jews has come to its end, and the Jews come back, and the Jews and Gentiles alike are welcomed into the flock of God. We're almost done. Don't worry. I'm trying to get us through this because I know that we've run over time. O nations! Who's he speaking to?
Everyone else.
The Gentiles.
Yeah.
Right? So this story, like this song doesn't end speaking to the Jews, it's ends speaking to the Gentiles. O nations, cause his people to shout for joy. Who are his people? Israel. So Moses ends by talking to the Gentiles and saying, hey, Gentiles, your job is to make the Jews sing for joy. O nations, cause his people to shout for joy, for he will avenge the blood of his slaves. He will render vengeance on his adversaries. He will atone for his land and his people. Who's going to bring about the atonement? Yahweh.
Yep.
Right? This whole Day of Atonement thing we talked about in Leviticus, Yahweh is going to be the one who actually makes it so that God and man can dwell together. The Gentiles should rejoice, for Yahweh will come for them, and by them he will bring Israel back to him. On the day of vengeance, he will restore the land and redeem the people, and therefore all creation. So he says, nations, y'all better rejoice, and you better make Israel rejoice. Because the day of vengeance is coming, and in that day, all things will be made new. Well, that's Revelation chapter 21 and 22. Yeah. New heavens, new earth. Jews and Gentiles alike dwelling with God. Right? That's what it is. Right? And so, if you understand Deuteronomy 32, you can interpret basically everything else that happens in the Bible. Right? It is fantastic. And we could go more in depth than what we did, but we just kind of rapid fired it because of time. Right? The way that Deuteronomy ends is with the death of Moses, right? Like we mentioned, Moses is not allowed to enter into the promised land because he did make some mistakes. And so, at the age of 120, he goes up a mountain, he looks into the promised land, but he does not get to enter. But he dies with his eyes on the promised land. There is one part where, before he dies, Moses does predict some more stuff about what's going to happen to the tribes. So just like Genesis ended with a prediction about like what was going to happen to the tribes of Israel, Moses does the same thing. For the sake of time, I'm not going to even quote this, but just go read it for yourself. He does make certain prophecies over the tribe of Joseph that are worth consideration and worth looking into. But the main thing I want to talk about here, which gets us to where I wanted to get to, is the end of the Torah, which we already read earlier, but I think it's a very interesting place to end. Because it tells us that after Moses died, Joshua took his place. And then these are the final words of the Torah. And there has not yet arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face, in regard to all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, and in regard to all the mighty power, and in regard to all the great terror which Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So the Torah ends saying that there's an issue. Right? We don't know when this was written, but we know it must have been written once they were already living in the land, right? Because we know that apparently time has passed, right? It wouldn't make sense for like the day that Moses died. They're like, oh, and even to this day, that prophet has not arisen. Well, yeah, it's been a day, right? So apparently a significant amount of time has passed, and the text says that prophet still hasn't shown up. And so you might wonder, well, what type of prophet are we looking for? Because originally Moses didn't really tell us that much, right? He said, a prophet like me is going to show up, you should listen to him. But right here, the text tells us, well, first off, this prophet's going to know God face to face. Well, how do you know he knows God face to face? Well, there's going to be certain things he's going to do that demonstrate that he's different. He's going to perform a bunch of signs and wonders comparable to what Moses did in Egypt. Right? These are not going to be like, it's not going to be a miracle here, a miracle there. This guy is going to demonstrate unparalleled power. Right? And Moses, whenever he talked about him back in Deuteronomy 18 or whatever it was, he says that the prophet's going to be even like better than him, right? So this guy's going to surpass Moses in his power. He's going to demonstrate mighty power, and he's going to produce great terror amongst the people of Israel, right? And so whatever this prophet does, he is going to be a miracle worker. He's going to be a teacher, and he's going to produce the fear of God in people. And so now we're waiting for that guy to show up. He's going to show up in the Gospels, right? There's going to be other prophets who show up, but they're not going to be quite like Moses. Right? You're going to be kind of like, you're going to get ones who are close to it, like Elijah. But even by the time you get to the New Testament, the people realize, oh yeah, I mean, that guy still hasn't shown up yet. Are you the prophet? Who are you? Right? And so the way the book of Deuteronomy literally ends is anticipating Jesus. And so there's the Torah. Next week, my goal is to go through the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. Right? We'll probably go through Joshua pretty quickly, and then we will go through Judges. It'll take us a little bit longer, but we'll get through it. Sound good?
All right.
All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for who you are. We praise you for giving us your word. And we praise you for just being worthy, God. Thank you for loving people like us. Thank you for welcoming us into the fold. We are not Jewish. We are not born of the bloodline of Abraham. But you have still sought us out, God. And that is an amazing privilege that I think that we don't really ponder enough, but it's amazing. Thank you for loving Israel so much that you are willing to come to us just to make them jealous. Help us love Israel with that same love. And help us love you. We love you, God, and we praise you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.